Hello again, and God's mercy and peace to all of you from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. This is a very sad topic, and my purpose is not to gloat over the sad issues that I'm going to discuss in this video. It has to do with the sad legacy of the late world famous Southern Baptist evangelist, Reverend Billy Graham's family. In both his nuclear family, more specifically among his children, and their spouses, and then in his extended family among his grandchildren, there have been a number of issues such as divorces, alcoholism, eating disorders, and the like. However, we cannot say that there would have been a so-called Graham curse, similar to the Kennedy curse, the youngest victim of which died apparently by suicide around the start of August 2019 at the tender age of 21. So this is the side of the family legacy of Billy Graham that is rarely discussed, and of course for good reason, in the sense that if we stick too much to discussing these issues, we forget the still profoundly and always profoundly important spiritual legacy left by the late Reverend Billy Graham and the late Mrs. Ruth Graham. The Grahams had, between the years 1945 and 1958, a total of 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Unfortunately, 3 of those 5 children now, of course, adults, and even the youngest one of whom is this year 61 years old, Ned Graham, the oldest one of whom, Virginia or Gigi, is already 74 years old this year, is that 3 of the 5 have divorced. And unfortunately, in the case of Ruth or Bunny Graham, there have been 3 divorces. She is now married to her 4th husband. Even the oldest child, Virginia or Gigi, is now living with her 3rd husband. And then Ned has been divorced once. The ones who are most in the public news, Bible teacher and evangelist Anne Graham Lotz, and Reverend and evangelist Franklin Graham have never divorced. Thank God for that. But anyway, I'm going to summarize what I found on the Washington Post website, WashingtonPost.com website, on the occasion of the elder Reverend Graham's death at the ripe old age of 99, back in February 2018, and then on the Christian Broadcast or Broadcasting Network's website about Ruth Graham, and then that was actually a televised interview, and then what I found on the Christian historyinstitute.org website. So no personal attacks intended, no gloating, no mocking of the righteous legacy of Billy or Ruth Graham and on the blessed ministries, as long as they focus on the spiritual issues of life of Anne Graham Lotz and Franklin Graham. But only through God's grace, Christian edification intended. Anyway, Billy Graham was for decades a very busy evangelist, which meant that when his children were growing up in the 1950s, 1960s, and in Ned's case, still in the early 1970s, they relatively rarely met him. And then relatively rarely for extended periods like weeks, let alone months. Billy Graham and Ruth Bell, who was the daughter of Presbyterian medical missionaries to China and who had actually gone to school for some years in what is now the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang. They met at Wheaton College in the fall of 1940 and fairly soon fell in love and married. Then, after graduating from the college, they married in August 1943. Although Billy remained a Baptist, actually he was a former Presbyterian, but having been convinced of the biblicalness of believers' baptism by immersion, he then changed his denominational allegiance. However, throughout most of his over 60 years of public preaching ministry, he became known as an interdenominational or even ecumenical evangelist who organized his mass evangelistic meetings or crusades on a broad interdenominational basis. There were charismatic Christians, Pentecostal Christians, of course, many evangelical Christians, most of the organizers and counselors and witnesses and choir members were evangelical Christians. And then there were even nominal members of the Roman Catholic Church who claimed to be born again. And then a significant number of members of the so-called mainline or traditional Protestant churches who also claimed to be born again. Ruth remained, however, a Presbyterian, and out of their 5 children, Ned grew up at the Montreat Presbyterian Church near their home in North Carolina, and he only became a Baptist just before being ordained an evangelist or pastor. And Billy Graham baptized his younger son. Well, anyway, in 1945, the same year when their first child, Virginia or Gigi, was born, Graham became a full-time evangelist. At first, he was briefly connected with the Youth for Christ interdenominational missions organization, but soon he established his own ministry, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and then the Hour of Decision broadcasts, actually segments of his many evangelistic sermons began to be aired in late 1950, according to his autobiography, Just As I Am. And then he crisscrossed the United States and Canada even, and many European countries, especially, of course, in the democratic Western Europe, but he even visited several then communist European countries. He also held crusades at times, although not frequently, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and even in Oceania occasionally. Perhaps sensing the start of a lifelong pattern and pregnant with their first child, Ruth moved in with her parents, Dr. Nelson Bell and her mother. in Montreat, North Carolina, a Presbyterian retirement community. The Bells provided her with companionship to ease the loneliness she felt during her husband's long absences, and were there to share important moments when their first child, Virginia, was born in 1945. Billy was away preaching. As Graham's crusades took him throughout the world, little was left for Ruth and the children. Gigi Ann, then Ruth, long called Bunny, to distinguish her, of course, from her mother, Franklin and Ned. Once, when Ruth brought Anne to a crusade and let her surprise her father while he was talking on the telephone, he stared at the toddler with a blank look, not recognizing his own daughter. In a turnabout a few years later, young Franklin greeted his father's homecoming from a crusade with a puzzled, "Who he?" To keep him in their hearts and minds, Ruth read Billy's letters aloud and guided the children as they prayed for him and his work. On Sunday afternoons, she gathered them together to listen to his voice on the Hour of Decision broadcast. Afterward, he usually talked with each of them. If the children commented on their father's absence, they were told he had gone somewhere to tell the people about Jesus. Gigi remembered that mother never said, "Daddy's going away for a month." Instead, she would say, "Daddy will be home in a month. We'll do such and such before he comes back." She also noted that, particularly when she was younger, "I thought everyone's daddy was gone. And my granddaddy was such a father figure for us." And thank God, the elderly Dr. Nelson Bell only died in 1973, when even the youngest of the five grandchildren, famous grandchildren he had, was about 15 years old. While Frank Graham, the world famous evangelist's father, died already in 1962. Then Mrs. Bell died, I think, in 1974, and then Mrs. Morrow Graham, the world famous evangelist's mother, died in 1981. But it never hit me that it was all that unusual. One Finnish writer has said, a female writer, children are survivors. Like, sometimes actually it is blissful that God doesn't allow them to fully realize the reasons behind their parents' absence. Well, of course, in the heartbreaking cases of divorce, especially when divorce has been caused by spousal abuse. And they somehow will get used to having only one parent at home, although, of course, many of them, probably most, will at times have questions. But then quite many of them will gradually quiet down and then turn to other pursuits like studies, hobbies, sports, friends, the internet, nowadays increasingly, and so forth. Whether it was perceived as unusual or not, the children did notice their father's absence. Once Ruth saw one of the girls sitting on the lawn staring wistfully at an airplane in the distance and calling out, "Bye, Daddy! Bye, Daddy!" The plane meant Daddy was going somewhere. Acquaintances from the early years remember that the Graham youngsters were less than models of decorum in their behavior at church and other public gatherings. But Ruth did her best to exercise a rather stern and consistent discipline at home. Sorry, as Billy Graham did fairly briefly note in his biography, he felt rather guilty and definitely sad at the fact that he was absent so often from his children when they were growing up, although he did emphasize his desire to be with them whenever he could. And of course, for much of the 1980s, my brother and I, who were then growing up from childhood into adolescence, remember that our father, who was for much of the 1980s an itinerant pastor, or then serving for a short period of time at 3 evangelical free churches, one in Stockholm, Sweden, the other two in Finland. Anyway, we remember that he came normally, was it on Monday, and then left some days later. At the very latest, he left on Friday. Except, of course, during the Christmas holidays when he was with us for at least several days in a row. And in the best case scenario, maybe for a couple of weeks even. And during the summer holidays, sorry, he tried to spend a lot of time with us. Sorry. And then, in order to make his children feel more secure, Billy Graham agreed with his wife Ruth not to argue publicly in front of them. Privately, they did at times argue. But as it turned out, their 3 daughters did at times have arguments with their husbands, and sadly, one of the 3 daughters has got divorced 3 times, another has got divorced twice. One is still married to her first and only husband. Gigi recalled, she, meaning her mother Ruth Graham, was strict. I got spanked nearly every day, Franklin too, and didn't seem to need it, but mother had a great sense of humor and we had a lot of fun. I have no memories of a screaming mother. When Billy was home, which was less than half the time, much of Ruth's disciplinary regimen went out the window. Mother would have us in a routine, Gigi recalled. She monitored our TV watching, made us do our homework, and put us to bed at a set time. Then when Daddy was home, he'd say, oh, let them stay up and watch his TV show with me, or he'd give us extra spending money for candy and gum. Mother always handled it with grace. She never said, well, here comes Bill. Everything I'm trying to do is going to be all messed up. She just said, whatever your daddy says is fine with me. Gigi offered a possible explanation of her father's more relaxed approach. Once when he disciplined me for something I did, I don't even remember what it was about. I ran up the stairs, and when I thought I was out of range, I stomped my feet. Then I ran into my room and locked my door. He came up the stairs 2 at a time, it sounded like, and he was angry. When I finally opened the door, he pulled me across the room, sat me on the bed, and gave me a real-time lashing. I said, some dad you are! You go away and leave us all the time. Immediately, his eyes filled with tears. It just broke my heart. That whole scene was always a part of my memory bank after that. I realized he was making a sacrifice too. But it does seem like he didn't discipline us much after that. Over time, Ruth also became more flexible, reducing the number of her demands on the children to those she thought were essential. But when they reached an appropriate age, I assume sometime in their teens, she and Billy sent all of them off to boarding school where they would both study and live. Bunny acknowledged that part of their motivation might have been to provide their children with a better education than was available locally, but thought that was a minor factor. Daddy was burdened, mother was overwhelmed. It was easier to send us away. Like her sisters, Bunny remembers being groomed for the life of wife, homemaker, and mother. There was never an idea of a career for us, she said, so they received a rather traditional upbringing. I wanted to go nursing school. Wheaton had a 5-year program, but Daddy said no. No reason, no explanation, just no. Franklin was always a handful. As an adolescent, he smoked, drank, and drove fast. Practices echoed in his adult image. He still rides a Harley Davidson, often preaches in a motorcycle jacket, and his first book was titled Rebel with a Cause. Ned, the youngest sibling, manifested his rebellion by turning to more than a casual use of drugs, including cocaine. While I was embroiled in all that, he recalled, my parents were just very patient. They expressed concern and displeasure over the behavior, but never once did they make me feel they rejected me as a person. Eventually, their grace and love were just irresistible. As adults, publicly and to a large extent privately, the Graham offspring have seldom said anything more negative about their family life than we weren't perfect. In recent years, daughter Ruth, now no longer known as Bunny because her mother passed away in 2007, has been more outspoken about what she regards as the disadvantages of growing up in a famous family. My father's relation with the family has been awkward, she said in a 2005 interview, because he has two families, BGEA, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and us. I always resented that. We were footnotes in books, literally. Well, we're not footnotes. We are real, living, breathing people. She said there was no question her father loved them, but his ministry was all-consuming. We have coped, she said. We have not rejected them or Christ. We're all involved in some form of ministry. I don't want to be indiscreet, but God inhabits honesty, and I'm not good at image management. Three of the 5 Graham children have divorced. Ruth was the first. When she discovered that her husband had been engaged in a long-running affair, she was devastated. At first, I resorted to my familiar pattern of denial, covering over my hurt with spiritual platitudes. I prayed, I fasted, I forgave. I claimed Bible promises. I did all I'd been taught to do. I also hid my problems from everyone, humiliated that others, especially my family, would find out. Her family did find out, and Graham's, meaning of course Billy Graham, strongly urged her not to divorce, telling her it would hurt millions of evangelical Christians who look to his ministry and their family for inspiration. After one crucial conversation, Ruth recalled, I saw how important the ministry was to him and how little the family was. Things had to look right, and divorce didn't fit. Ruth acknowledged, however, that once they realized the marriage was over, they were always very loving. We all, she said, still have to work through the mess and muck of life. You can't just slap a Bible verse over a wound and expect it to heal. This article was written by William Martin, the Harry and Hazel Chaban Professor Emeritus, in other words, retired of religion and public policy at Rice University. And then let's go to her CBN, or Christian Broadcast or Broadcasting Corporation Network. Sorry. Interview with 700 Club producer Shannon Woodland. So I'll just read segments of it, and of course, once again, I don't intend to infringe on any copyrights. I admire Ruth Graham for having spoken out publicly for what probably for millions of Christian women, especially in the less developed countries of the world, like most Asian and African countries, has been a private tragedy that their husbands have been unfaithful to them. They have tried to work things out, but their husbands eventually have divorced or have forced them to divorce them. Excuse me, having abandoned them. Shannon Woodland, Ruth, the obvious question is, and maybe it's rather trite, but why write a book? She was referring to Ruth Graham's latest book. In every pew sits a broken heart. And pews, of course, are those usually long benches on which people sit at churches. But why write a book about all the hard things in your life? Why do that? Ruth Graham, the reason I wrote the book was that for years I sat in the pew with a broken heart. What was the hardest thing to write about? What was the hardest thing to often think about? Ruth Graham, certainly my own frailties. I think the thing that is very difficult for me is that disastrous second marriage. I really had not talked about this publicly. May I be so bold to say you are Billy Graham's daughter? I'd think you'd have your act all together. Ruth Graham, it doesn't matter who you are or what family you come from. Life happens, and life brings you blows that you don't expect. Shannon Woodland, did you set standards for yourself that were superhuman? Was that part of the problem? Ruth Graham, I had a self-imposed image that I thought I had to maintain. It was some idea, and the idea that I had to carry God's reputation. I wanted God to look good. God can carry his own reputation, thank you very much. He doesn't need my help. Woodland, why did you think it was necessary to go that far, even with your children with the difficulties? Graham, first let me say that I had their permission and they had editorial rights. We don't want to hang out the dirty laundry, so to speak. We try very hard not to do that. We talked about how God was faithful to us through these situations. The daughter who had the eating disorder talks to groups of teenagers about this. The daughter who had the two babies out of wedlock, so being unmarried, is helping others who are going through the same thing. And my son, who dabbled in drugs, talks very openly in his testimony about how God has seen him through all that. We want to minister, and being authentic allows for ministry. And Graham continues. They were certainly hurt by what happened. They watched my struggles and they hurt for me, but they were so supportive and so loving. I had made a terrible choice and went into a disastrous second marriage. I was going home. Questions rolled in my mind. As I rounded the last bend in my parents' driveway in Montreat, North Carolina, by the way, and saw my father standing there, I got out of the car and he wrapped his arms around me and said, "Welcome home." It was a wonderful picture of a father's love for a broken child. Woodland, what do you hope that this book will do for people? What was your ultimate goal? Graham, I sort of had two goals in mind. One was for people who are hurting to know they are not alone, and that struggle is part of the human condition, that no one is exempt. Being a Christian doesn't mean that everything is going to fall into place and that life is going to be smooth. I certainly say a big amen to that. And actually, certain Christians need these trials. I'm not delighted by that. I'm not delighted by the uh, things that I have gone through, mostly because of my own sins, I will admit, without going into a detailed confession. I'm not delighted by the fact that my mother, my dear late mother, was for the last 12 years of her life so sickly. And for several of those years, even at times quite depressed or suffering from that bipolar manic depressive disorder. But some Christians, especially those who are either hyper charismatics or so called charismaniacs, or then prosperity gospel Christians, word of faith Christians, or maybe even both, they need such trials sent to them by God to become humble and broken and profoundly thankful in His sight and profoundly dependent on Him alone ultimately, because ultimately only He can help us. But I go on. Then my other goal was to equip people who want to minister to the hurting but don't know how. I wanted to give tools to people who wanted to help, and I wanted to make it a practical book as well. And again, I say a big amen.